Hello everyone. Good afternoon. The Policy and Conflict Resolution Study Centers affiliated with the Arab American University in Jenin and Balthink in Gaza are pleased to host Gary Mason to present his thoughts. Gary Mason, and Nicola Brady to present their thoughts and ideas on the issue of the lessons of the Irish peace process, the role of civil society in preparing the grounds for reconciliation. Reconciliation is emerging strongly in peace studies, where it overlaps with conflict resolution, conflict transformation, and even with normalization at different levels and in different tracks. If conflict goes through different stages and multiple phases, such as the emergence of the conflict, the escalation, the peak, the de-escalation, peacemaking, and peace building, it is same with the reconciliation, where we cannot expect this process to be, done, at once. Every one of us, I think, knows that the American theorist, eminent American theorist, John Ladrack, in his masterpiece from Notre Dame University, in his book, Sustainable Reconciliation in Divided Society, published in 1997, he defined reconciliation as building a new sustainable relationship between rival groups, communities, and states. Reconciliation cannot be recovered cannot be recovered unless we put the seeds of trust, confidence, and mercy in the proper soil. It is achievable when justice, peace, and development are really met. Reconciliation is a real hard process through which society moves from divided past to share future and the brighter future for generations to come. It is more to do with liberal peace project that entails democracy, election, justice, fairness, dealing with the past, and healing the injuries of the victims. It has also legal framework through which the perpetrators should go to the court at certain stages. In this context, we feel that civil society role and social movements in general are very much important in order to bridge the differences, to sustain the progress, to provide platforms for dialogue, to document violation of human rights, and to act as advocacy and lobbying, and to spread the fruits of real development and real justice to local communities. In this context, we are hosting Gary Mason and Nicola Brady in the center, in the Policy and Conflict Resolution Study Center and Balthink in this afternoon to present their thought. Gary Mason is a PhD holder in psychology from Ulster University. He is Methodist minister. He is also founder of Rethinking Conflict, acting as a research fellow at Kennedy Institute for Conflict Intervention at Maynooth University in Dublin. In brief, he is facilitator, peace builder, good communicator, strategist, and influencer. Please, Gary, the floor is yours, and take your time, divide your time with Nicola. You are welcome again, Gary.
Okay, look, thank you so much for your welcome, and it's good to see you all. It's good to see my good friend and colleague, Dalal, as well. We've known each other a number of years since Dalal spent some time with me in Belfast. So I don't want to give you a long, protracted outline of the Irish conflict, but maybe just a couple of things to say that hopefully will contextualize what Nicola and I are going to say to you. I mean, the Irish conflict probably goes back to the 12th century. 16th, 17th century probably shaped this island for almost 400 years. And really in those 400 years, there probably hasn't been a 25-year period where there hasn't been some form of violence and conflict. The period that I lived through was from 69 up until 1998. Now, Northern Ireland, or the north of Ireland, people call it different names, as your space in Palestine is called different names by different constituencies, depending on your political persuasion. Very small population. We're almost nearly reaching 2 million now. But during the conflict, you had about 1.5, 1.6 million people. Literally, some people think Palestine's small. Well, you can drive 2 hours from Northern Ireland at the top to the border and east-west almost in 2 hours. So it's a pretty tiny space. But over those 30 years, we had 47,000 injuries, 36,000 shootings, 22,000 armed robberies, 30,000 people went through our penal system, with 16,000 bombings and almost 4,000 dead. Now, I often extrapolate those figures if I'm speaking in the United States and saying to people in universities and different spaces in the United States, if the Irish conflict in those 30 years had have happened in the United States, you would have had 700,000 dead, 6 million political prisoners, 9 million injuries, 7 million shootings, and 3 million bombings. So as Nicola and I speak to you tonight, I mean, we're just finished a 2-hour seminar this morning with another 30 or 40 colleagues. The biggest issue for our space at the moment is legacy, which you alluded to, Ahmad, in your opening, and dealing with the past. I mean, as most of us know, conflict primarily involves 3 things: land, identity, and religion. Invariably, no matter where you look at Colombia, South Africa, the Balkans, look at your space, those 3 components invariably are playing about somewhere above the surface, or if not above the surface, at least below the surface. So what we want to do today is to ask the question, do civil society groups, civil society actors, academics, women's groups, NGOs play a key role in conflict transformation and peace building? Now, it's been suggested, you may agree or disagree, we can discuss this later, that many efforts to end the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, one of the reasons they're failing, some are suggesting this, is due to a flawed methodology in pursuing a peace process. Some people suggest people are looking at the conflict as if it's a kind of a technical problem that can be resolved by a very selected and exclusive leadership. Now, you could suggest that that strategy is actually failing to address a very complex entanglement of grievance, belief, ideology, which characterizes your region's context and which are at the root of the problem. So I'm suggesting to you, what would an inclusive peace process look like in the Middle East? Senior and mid-level political leaders, community leaders, women's groups, academics, religious leaders, civil society.
Sorry, Gary, can I interrupt you just a
Yes,
minute?
by all means.
بس بدي أنوه إنه بتقدروا الترجمة هلأ شغالة، فما في لغة عربية، بيقدروا اللي بيحبوا يسمعوا باللغة العربية بس يكبسوا على الفرنش، والإنجليزي إنجليزي، وبسمعوا الترجمة من خلال الفرنش language على الأيقونة اللي تحت. Thank you, Gary. You can continue.
Yes, no, that's fine. I mean, Ayman, you mentioned there John Paul Lederach, and actually I think Dalal knows this. John Paul Lederach's parents, John and Naomi, actually worked with me for 2 years in Belfast in the mid-1990s. And although I don't have it in the slide, I don't think Nicola has as well, but his peace-building pyramid talks about the role of what he calls mid-level civic society actors, as you know. So I want to ask a question. Why do people at times have this tendency to ignore what we call civic society peace builders? There was United Nations Under Secretary General 1986-97, Marek Golding, involved in a number of different peace settlements in a number of regions. And he was giving a talk in New York at the UN. At the end of the meeting, someone puts up their hands and asks him the question, do you think NGOs have a role to play in the United Nations efforts to maintain peace and security? He answered the question with an unequivocal no. He said the United Nations is an association of governments. He says NGOs can help to relieve hardship, but they have no role in negotiation and implementations of peace settlements. Years later, to give him credit, he openly admitted that he was ignorant, he was arrogant, and that he wouldn't give the same answer today. He says that non-state actors have played an increasingly important role, both in the resolution of eternal conflicts and as a channel for public participation in peacemaking. And it was interesting, a number of years ago, I had a number of key actors from Iraq who spent about a week in Belfast and then in Dublin. And before they left to fly home to Iraq, I remember saying to them, tell me, you've had a week, politicians, victims groups, non-state actors, religious leaders, academics. What lesson will you take back to Iraq? And these three people at a pretty senior level all said to me, Gary, the role of civic society in peace building. They said civic society in Iraq is at a very poor place and it's not empowered the way it actually is in the Irish context. And it's interestingly, people from your space who have spent time with me in Belfast often highlight a number of factors that are applicable in your space as they have been in our space. And they often say, you know, Gary, political leadership is essential in achieving peace. So in our space, really, what happened in the early 1990s, we had what we called a mutually hurting stalemate. So very simply put, both sides realized that we were completely at a stalemate. We could go on killing each other for another 100 years. We'd already been doing it for 400 years. Or we could empower political leadership to believe that change was actually preferable to the status quo. But empower those religious leaders to take the risks to achieve peace, but also providing the vision that ensured that they maintained the confidence of their grassroots supporters. The second thing that really came into play in our space to end the conflict, moving up to the Good Friday Agreement, was really a desire to save future generations from the cycle of violence. And that emerged on both sides, nationalist, republican, and unionist and loyalist. And that desire for a better future actually encouraged leaders to take the risks and face down accusations of betrayal from within their own communities to achieve peace. The third thing that always comes up, be it Palestinians or Israelis, when they're with me in Belfast, they say, Gary, you don't understand. And I know exactly what they're going to say. I say, tell me what I not understand. We don't trust each other. And I say to them, look, listen, a lack of trust between opposing sides is an inevitable feature of building peace. It can't be used as a justification for not beginning the process. When people like me, as a much younger clergy person, moved into dialogue with the IRA and Sinn Féin and the loyalist groupings in the late 1980s, I can assure you those first meetings were not hugs and kisses. They were not. But too many people use this concept of a lack of trust as a justification for not beginning the process in the first place. Trust never comes at the start of a process, but only through time, through dialogue, and at times meeting secretly by making and meeting commitments and building confidence through concrete actions. Another thing we often say in our space is this, that attempts to resolve the conflict through military force were ultimately futile. And they didn't result in sustainable security for either side. So what happened in our space simply was, you hurt us, we'll hurt you. So it ended up like a game of table tennis or ping pong, back, forward, back, forward, back, forward. In reality, security was only achieved when dialogue was really prioritized and the root causes of the conflict were addressed. And exactly the same in your space. Until the root causes of conflict are addressed in your space, the conflict will continue to go on. We had to address those by new frameworks, new political institutions that gave space for each community to pursue their visions for Northern Ireland. And the fifth lesson really is the role of civic society. And we have this theory here that Nicola and I know well called the political peace process versus the social peace process. And George Mitchell, as we moved up to the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, said a very prophetic statement. He said, if you think getting this agreement was difficult, implementing it will be even more difficult. Now, I have many friends who are politicians, as does Nicola, but politicians by their very nature, and if you're a politician on here tonight, take this in the spirit it's given, politicians by their very nature are people of short-term memory. Most politicians, the most important thing in their lives is the next election. So politicians assume that once the deal is done, societal healing will automatically follow. In reality, nothing could be further from the truth. And if there's anything you take away from Nicola and I tonight is 23 years after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, we are still implementing our peace process. 23 years. The unfinished business of building peace is still there. So just a couple of points, and then I'm going to pass to Nicola, and then I'm going to come back to myself. I mean, why should civic society, you could ask me, say, Gary, like, why should civic society have any participation in the peace process? And one academic gives a number of reasons, so just highlight them briefly. Participation is a fundamental human right. That's the first thing. We do need political participation. I mean, it's essential for determining the will of the people. But civic society needs to engage with that. Also supporting democratic values. I mean, if you have a process that is participatory, it will enhance democratic values and structures. Also, civic society will bring enhanced legitimacy into that public space. Ownership of agreements. I mean, when any peace process is implemented, you want a broad ownership of agreement that will create the sustainability of a settlement. The more actors involved, actually, the better. And widening the agenda is absolutely crucial. And coordinating your initiatives through a process of participation will enable more effective communication between actors and less duplication of initiatives, really binding people together in a common process. Now, as many of you know, the Good Friday Agreement, we've had government up in our space, government down, up, down, up, down. So from January 2017 to January last year in 2020, we had no government. We had no devolved assembly in Belfast. And people often used to say to me, Gary, why did you not go back to conflict? I mean, you have no politicians. It's primarily just civil servants who are running the country. And I often used to say this very simply, but hopefully very profoundly, that civic society is really the social glue that holds our peace process together. That's not diminishing the role of politicians, but a strong civic society, which we have created in the Northern Irish space, has been the social glue that has really held our peace process together. So for example, Nicola and I this morning were in a room of 40 other people, as wide a range of people as you could imagine. People on the pro-British side who were non-state actors. People on the pro-Irish side who were non-state actors, who very simply put, 30 years ago, wanted to kill each other. With politicians in the room, with religious leaders in the room, with academics in the room, with young emerging leaders in the room. So trying to create a biggest space as you can bring as many diverse voices to the table can be a key role for civic society. And my colleague, Dr. Nicola Brady, is currently the General Secretary of the Irish Council of Churches, has worked with a number of different initiatives over the years. And she's just going to take a few moments to do a case study, really asking what are the role of some religious actors in civic society and peace building. So Nicola is going to walk us through that. Pass back to me. I'll do another presentation and then we can open it up for a wider conversation. So Nicola, we're in your hands. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Gary, and thank you to all the organisers. It's a real privilege to be invited to come and share with you this evening something of my experience. I work, as Gary said, with Christian church leaders on the island of Ireland. I'm responsible for what we call our national interchurch structures, and that means that we provide a space for Christian leaders to come together for dialogue, for relationship building, and for collaborative action. And that collaborative action is usually focused on issues of social justice, of peace and reconciliation. And so often that gives me the opportunity to work with Gary as well. Gary's asked me to address the complex and often controversial role of religious actors in the civic space. And so I thought that the most helpful thing that I could do might be to share a case study from our experience. So if I can share my screen. And the case study that I have chosen to share comes from that period that Gary mentioned when we had no government. It was an initiative called the Church Leaders Civil Society Dialogue Initiative. Not a particularly imaginative title, it literally tells you exactly what it was, but it was an attempt by religious leaders to support the mobilization of civil society in a context of political crisis. So I hope that in sharing some reflections from this period, there might be some questions and learning that are also relevant for your context. So let me begin by expanding on what Gary has already mentioned about the nature of the problem. We found ourselves in 2018 in a context where Northern Ireland's devolved Legislative Assembly had been suspended since January 2017. So what that meant was a significant leadership vacuum where we had no government ministers in key areas like education and health. And civil servants were also not permitted to make decisions in areas that were considered to be controversial or significant in terms of new public spending, etc. And as you will know, in a society emerging from conflict, almost any policy decision can be considered to be controversial. And in a segregated society dealing with the legacy of conflict, any meaningful interventions around issues of social deprivation entail new public spending. So we were in a serious state of paralysis in terms of government leadership and with significant gaps in public policy. And what this meant for us was significant uncertainty about the future of essential public services. And it was, of course, those who were most vulnerable who were being the worst affected. For example, there were gaps in social welfare provision, where ordinarily those organisations supporting people on the ground would have brought these to the attention of a minister or a senior civil servant. There'd have been a policy change, an amendment to legislation, and the issue would have been addressed. But this could not happen. And so we had people who were not receiving social welfare payments, and it was resulting in real suffering. During this period, there were also no political negotiations taking place to restore our devolved institutions, primarily because the British and Irish governments were very focused on Brexit. They had had several rounds of failed negotiations since January 2017, and by this stage, they had almost given up. They were not calling the political leaders together. Cross-party meetings were not happening because there was no functioning government. And so those normal spaces where politicians from different political parties would come together to collaborate did not exist. And that had a significant impact on relationships. We had a very polarized public discourse in the media, which was very often characterized as toxic. And democracy was undermined because the voters were disenfranchised. Their elected representatives could not fulfill the responsibilities they had been elected to. And so the church leaders meeting together asked themselves what they could do to help. And the first thing they did was to engage with the grassroots experience of local faith communities. And so we undertook an evidence gathering consultation with local churches, particularly local churches in deprived areas, faith-based charities, and faith representatives working in areas such as community relations. And we gathered the evidence from their experience about issues like the gaps in social welfare provision, the families that were being left without payments, gaps in social care, particularly those impacting services for children and young people, and examples of areas where public services were coming under an impossible strain. There was also a qualitative aspect to this analysis, drawing on the church's pastoral experience. So we collected experiences about concerns for people's mental health and emotional well-being, concerns about the impact of young people, and particularly the bad example that people felt was being set for them through this very polarized and toxic public discourse. Now, this grassroots engagement, I would suggest, was essential for establishing the legitimacy of Christian church leaders when they were seeking to engage in the public square in this way. Because religious leaders, of course, do not stand for election. And in a context where there's a lack of trust, the basis for their engagement needs to be very clear. Other participants in the dialogue need to be confident that religious leaders will respect political processes. Following this grassroots engagement, the next step was an invitation from church leaders to the leaders of the 5 largest political parties to join them all together for a meeting. Now, this invitation entailed an element of risk for church leaders. It could have undermined them or even exposed them to public ridicule if no one had accepted their invitation. Also, the framing of the invitation was crucial. Religious leaders were not seeking to replace the role of the British and Irish governments and take over the negotiation process. So they had to make clear in their invitation that this was a different type of conversation. The churches were seeking to use their pastoral experience to create a context outside of the formal political processes, where there would be space for listening and challenge in both directions. So political leaders would be challenged to hear about the impact of the political impasse at the level of local communities and how it was affecting the lived experience of people on the ground. At the same time, the church leaders indicated that they would be willing to listen to political leaders about the challenges that they faced, and particularly those areas where they felt civil society was not supporting them, where people were saying that they wanted peace, but actually telling their political leaders not to compromise on any issues. And it was found when the invitation was accepted by all party leaders that, first of all, this was a significant intervention, because when they came together in September 2018, this would be the first time that all party leaders had been in the same room for 8 months. The churches were able to bring their pastoral approach by creating a different type of context. And in particular, they asked political leaders how this impasse was impacting them personally, and showed empathy and understanding for the fact that they found themselves unable to do the job they were elected to do. And this was something that was often not reflected in the media analysis. And then finally, there was hospitality, which is something that faith communities do very well, ending the conversation with informal exchange over a meal. And we know that this type of exchange and relationship building can be really important in support of political processes. And so the outcomes were that the party leaders fed back to church leaders that they had found this exchange to be very helpful for them. And they asked them to replicate the meeting on a regional basis to help compensate for the lack of cross-party meetings and bring in some of their colleagues in different areas. The British and Irish governments also invited church leaders to brief them on the conversation and on their approach, and they encouraged the church leaders to take up this proposal for regional meetings. So the church leaders agreed, but they insisted on expanding the invitation to include wider civil society representation because they felt it was no longer appropriate for the conversation to be limited to religious and political leaders alone. They also received financial support for the initiative from the Community Relations Council in Northern Ireland. The amount of funding was not significant. What was important here was the collaborative nature that it established. So by engaging with the Community Relations Council, it was a further source of legitimacy for religious leaders. And together they delivered 4 dialogue events across Northern Ireland, bringing together approximately 120 civil society representatives with a cross-party panel of elected representatives between December 2018 and February 2019. The theme for the initiative was collective responsibility for the common good. And 2 of the national church leaders, one Protestant, one Catholic, chaired each of the regional events. And they took the opportunity to speak in very personal terms about their friendship and how it helped them overcome difference. And as they shared in some of the meetings, their friendship enabled them to go together places where it would have been very difficult for them to go as individuals. They also took care to enforce the role of local churches by enlisting local church leaders as facilitators of the roundtable discussions. This not only helped with legitimacy, but would also ensure that there could be a sustainable impact from the initiative by developing local relationships. And there was a very positive response from the civic leaders because they recognized that churches were providing a space when no one else had stepped up to do this. And the emphasis on shared responsibility was very welcome. So in May 2019, when the British and Irish governments re-established formal negotiations, church leaders were invited to come and make a formal presentation of the findings from their initiative in the middle of negotiations. And this is what you see reflected in the picture here, which is really something quite unprecedented and under other circumstances might have received a significant challenge in the media. But again, people recognized that the churches had stepped up to provide a space where no one else had. Their report was entitled "A Time for Courageous and Compassionate Leadership," and this reflects many of the key themes coming out of the conversations. So I'm just going to briefly share some of the key messages. First of all, there was the importance of acknowledging the reality of a divided society and setting the context for this type of discussion. So church leaders said that sectarianism remains a pervasive problem in Northern Ireland society. And they pointed out that the political vacuum that we were experiencing then was both a cause and a consequence of the breakdown in trust. And they pointed to a long history of political instability leading up to this point and cautioned about a drift away from the commitment to the peace process. As I said, our society is fractured and it requires courageous leadership to bridge those gaps. The protection of democracy was a really important theme, and the church leaders highlighted the responsibilities of political leaders, particularly in a context where a society was emerging from conflict and there were pressures on relationships. As they pointed out, While a certain amount of antagonism is to be expected in normal political debate, it is possible to have positive, respectful, personal relationships in spite of political differences. Our opponent does not have to be our enemy. Collective responsibility, reflected in the theme for the event, was unsurprisingly one of the recurring messages throughout. As the church leader said, when politics is broken, the responsibility for fixing it does not rest with the politicians alone. Civil society had been willing to step up to address some of the gaps, as Gary has already mentioned. And church leaders were also keen to point out that political leaders' engagement with civil society cannot be limited to crisis interventions, and this had been one of the weaknesses of our political process up to this point. And so they argued that political decision-making needs to be shaped and informed by the experience and expertise of civic leaders on the ground, and the role of civic society in holding elected representatives to account needs to be supported and respected. The tone of the political debate was something that was cited by many of the civil society leaders as their reason for accepting the church leaders' invitation. They were so concerned about what they were seeing on TV, and particularly the impact that that was having on young people. And so religious leaders called political leaders to weigh their words carefully, and highlighted in particular how young people were looking to those in leadership to inspire them with confidence about their future and promote a culture of aspiration, as they too were struggling with the impact of uncertainty. And accepting and respecting difference as part of the normal political processes and the experience of living together in society. And they argued that it is possible to have a robust debate that is respectful when participants are willing to listen and recognize the legitimacy of other perspectives. And our experience in these civic society dialogues really underlined that, and they drew attention to the importance of political debate being reasoned and evidence-based and firmly grounded in the realities that people are facing. They also challenged the media and challenged individuals about how they use social media in this context. And finally, it was all important to bring a message of hope. And it was our experience that during these dialogues, by bringing people together, being honest about the difficult realities that people were facing, notwithstanding the severity of the challenges, actually created a hope-filled encounter, because people saw that they were free to share about their experiences, and they were also encouraged by the coming together and the willingness of people to recommit to the peace process and to the common good. So some of the learning out of this experience then, firstly, it was that complex, deep-rooted societal challenges can only be addressed through collaborative leadership. Nothing else can meaningfully move that dial, and someone needs to initiate that process. And sometimes, not always, religious leaders can find themselves in a position where they have the convening authority to get people in the room. But there are several factors that will be crucial to the success of that invitation. Firstly, that religious actors approach it with humility and are willing to share their own vulnerabilities as leaders. That they demonstrate respect for difference, critically respect for democratic political processes, and that they have that connection to the grassroots experience of local faith communities, which is their source of legitimacy as religious actors in supporting political processes. And finally, that this type of work cannot be limited to crisis interventions. These relationships need ongoing attention, and we cannot afford complacency. And that is it, Gary. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure out how to stop sharing my screen. There we go.
That is great. Look, thank you, Nicola, so much for that. What I'm going to do is really just build in the back there really of what Nicola has been saying, and just really walk you through a project I was involved in a number of years ago, and to also share a possibility I mean, as many of you know that $250 million US dollars was eventually passed in Congress at the end of last year, and is going to spill out into obviously Palestinian society and Israeli society from 2022 onwards. The purpose of that funding, as you know, is really to use the phraseology, to strengthen civil society in your arena and empower them towards peace building. I've been loosely involved in writing some of the bits and pieces in relation to that, which has gone to the sort of US Congress, looking at some of the models in the Irish context. So Rula, I'm not as technical as my younger colleague Nicola, so you're going to help me walk through my PowerPoint. And I said to Nicola on the phone today, I have a book behind me that a friend in the States said, learning the intricacies of Zoom. I need to sit down in the next few weeks and do that, but let's just walk through this in the meantime. Let's see, do you have the other one, the Skenos, the 5 or 6 slides I sent you probably a week or so ago? That was just my initial slide. And if you want to plunder for them, take your time there, or I can resend them if necessary. But look, while Rula's doing that, let me just kind of use that slide, and hopefully the other ones will spill up in due course. A number of years ago, in the early 1990s, when I was a lot younger, I was doing some work in South Africa, facilitating dialogue between whites and blacks. And I visited this project called the Ark. Now, what was the Ark? The Ark was a disused railroad station right on the dock front of Durban. And it had a multiplicity of different social engagements. So, for example, you had young black women from townships were learning skills like hairdressing, young men were learning to be motor mechanics, etc., etc., etc. And it really left a very marked impression on me. That was September 1991. In October 1991, I was in Atlanta, Georgia. And I met a guy called Bob Lupton, who had moved from Decatur. Now, if you know Atlanta, Decatur is the kind of affluent area of Atlanta, and he had moved into the inner city in Atlanta. Very, very difficult space. And what he was doing was creating zones within the inner city and really creating what he called mixed income housing. So he would have had maybe an architect living next door to a street cleaner, etc., etc., etc. And today, I mean, I remember being in that area, honestly, in 1991 and visiting it over maybe a 10-year period, and then looking at it today. So let me tell you what that area is like today. It's a YMCA. It's swimming pools. It's high schools. It's got grocery stores. So over a period of 20 years or thereabouts, that area has been absolutely transformed, not through politicians, but through civic society. Rula, if it's helpful, I can flip back into my emails here and put that through to you. And if you don't find it, listen, it's not a doomsday scenario.
It's only one page here.
Yeah, hold on. I sent you this, maybe it's about 2 weeks ago, so maybe that's why you're not finding it. So I'll just step back into this and talk at the same time. So what I'm hoping Rula will eventually put up is a project called Skenos. It was a project that took place over a number of years, and it actually cost, it was a pretty sizable amount. It cost 30 million US dollars. And really the way I described it, I mean, Dalal has been there, so she can maybe do a bit of this lecture along with me. And Dalal, as we probably said, it was a kind of a post-conflict, shared space, urban village. A kind of post-conflict, shared space, urban village. And the idea of that was to create what I called a sort of birth to death approach to conflict transformation. So yes, so there were elements of that were developed or to do specifically with conflict transformation, but it also created a space that really, what I would have said, everyday life would have spilled in. So the good news is, I've just found this email, which I'm now resending.
Yeah.
There it is. So it's coming through it's just to let folks see some of these. So within that, what we did as an organization we actually partnered with other organizations. So the organization I was heading up was a religious body called East Belfast Mission. But we partnered with a NGO that looked after the elderly. We partnered with a theatre company. We partnered with a counselling clinic. And we really created this whole collaboration of different civil society actors. Now, I went there in 1999. So just to give an idea of some of the possibilities and the dreams that can be possible for your space as well. That's it. So when I arrived there, budget-wise, we had about 20 staff and a budget of probably $1 million US. And over a period of 10 to 15 years, we grew that. So that's it there, really, the arts and business presentation, if you're able to get that up. We grew that to 100 staff, 150 volunteers, and a budget of between $5 to $6 million. So I'm just going to walk you through these slides. I just think it's important. I mean, obviously, Nicola knows this space. I know it. Dalal has been there as well. So we called it Community Transformation and Renewal in East Belfast. So East Belfast, the area we were in, out of 550 electoral wards in Northern Ireland, was the 5th worst place to live across health indicators, education indicators, and social indicators. So it was a pretty messy space to be. And I remember, and here's an interesting phrase for the colleagues there in Gaza and also in Ramallah. An economic consultant described it to me. He said, Gary, let's hope this is the silver tent pole that lifts this whole area. So it was really to put something into that space that gradually would cascade out wider and begin to transform and renew that area. So really, if you just want to flip to my next slide there, that'll be great. Now, if they're not coming up, don't worry, I can continue to talk without any visible things in front of me.
رولا next slide رولا.
أنا عارفة هاي نعم بجرب دكتور من عندي هيها ما زبطت مش شايفينها.
هاي أول واحد أنت حاطة سلايد.
هاي أول واحدة هاي الثانية. ما بينت عندكم الثانية؟
لا.
Look, while you're playing with the technicalities, I'll root down into a few more bits and pieces. So as part of that centre, I mean, as well as it having a religious overtone, it also had a homeless centre and an employability centre. And we also put a space into it for the Irish language. So, I mean, the Irish language here has been quite controversial because it's ended up associated with one particular side in a conflict. And what we were trying to say was, listen, this language should be for all people. So we're trying to bring more inclusivity actually into that space and to allow that language not to be seen as a means of division. So just as these slides come up, I mean, I'll just highlight them there bit by piece. So we try to use art and symbolism as ways to create new ways of imagining. So as you know, in the Palestinian space, you have lots of artwork on your separation barrier. Belfast is also awash with political posturing and artwork on both sides. So we try to create art and symbolism to allow people to imagine actually in a different way and in a different space. And one of the other things we did as well, there's a square within that whole Skenos project. This is good timing, rule of you. So that square there that was up briefly a minute ago, it was interestingly, when I was putting this together, a couple of Dublin business people came to me and they said to me, Gary, as only business people can, looking down their noses, I think a bit at me, you're making a mistake. And I says, tell me, what is the mistake? And they said, see that square that's in front of you now? Don't be doing a square there. Pack it with business units, pack it with shops and make more money. And my answer to them was, I understand what you're saying. However, this is not just about making money. I want it to be economically sustainable. But most people that live in the inner city, they've nowhere to go. They don't have a square. They don't have a space. So this is not just about physical regeneration. It's about mental, spiritual, physical, and emotional. And we ended up with this square. And in the few sunny days that we get here in this space, people are able to spill out into that square. This other phrase there that just came up there a moment ago, increasing the porousness of the community. Belfast is a very segregated space. So one of the things we were trying to do was to create a space that would be porous. So people from different faith traditions, political traditions, could spill into this space to allow it to be a space that all people could be in. So shared space politically, generationally, health, social, and environmental. So just finally, and then I'll tie this up a little and then we can move to questions. We actually did this sort of, you can see, vertical garden. So let me tell you a humorous story. Sometimes when people from your region are with me, they're pretty convinced, as some Irish and British are, that yours is the worst conflict that ever existed. As many British Irish people are convinced ours is the worst conflict that ever existed. People in South Africa may say the same. People in the Balkans may say the same. People in Colombia may also say the same. And so I tell them the story about this vertical garden. So here's an interesting story. The people that built this or designed it were from the Netherlands. They were Dutch. And in a meeting with them once, we said, now, believe it or not, plants within the Irish context can be politically charged. Okay, now bear with me in this story. You're probably going, is Gary going crazy? And we were saying, now, on the Catholic Irish side, to celebrate the Easter Rebellion or Easter Rising, they were in their lapels white lilies. It's a political statement. The Protestants British, if you remember, William of Orange was the Dutch king that defeated the Catholic King James on the 12th of July, which is a big parade in this part of the world. They were orange lilies. So you can imagine these Dutch men and women were sitting, scratching their heads in Belfast going, what the hell are these crazy Irish people talking about, that flowers are actually politically charged? And we were saying, now, don't be putting any white lilies or orange lilies in this space because they have a political connotation. So they ended up putting this vertical garden there, as you have seen, and it's meant to represent a field in County Down, which is a county in the northern part of Ireland. My hope or possible dream, I would love in the future to see a Skenos Centre on the seam between East and West Jerusalem, where people can actually engage or be together and create a space where people can begin to share their lives together, as well as lifting the employability in some of those more difficult spaces within Jerusalem. So look, I'm going to pause there. I think I've talked enough. Nicole's come in with her contribution there as well, and we'll open it up to questions or comments or conversation. So about 30 minutes or so left. So I pass back to my good friend Ahmad, and he can guide us the best way to hear one another. So go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Gary. Thank you, Nicola, for both the presentations. Really very much enlightened, very much, informative, very much, analytical in the right direction. And I think we can learn, many lessons from both presentations. And I guess both, even at theory level, good theorization, good conceptualization, and certain case studies from the field also, have given some enriching, flavor to both the presentations. I agree with you, Gary, that land, identity, and religion are the main causes of many conflicts all over the world. And even if we look deeper, I think we can find some other reasons. But these are the main categories. These are the main manifestations of our conflicts at different level. And I agree with both of you that civil society can play a crucial role. Civil society with NGOs, universities, intellectuals, academics, social movements, and other types of organizations who are spread in the space between the market and the state really can play such role. The dialogue between religious leaders, political leaders, and civic leaders is this is a new experience in the Irish context. It can give in many signals and many ramifications for different spots of conflict. I don't want to make to take much longer time. I think we can start now with your questions, your comments, your suggestions. Please, you can raise your hand and we can take one or two questions. I'll go back to Gary and Nicola to answer, and again we'll go for another round of questions. Please, feel free to ask your questions and put your notes and comments. Any question يا جماعة؟ Yes, دينا إسماعيل اتفضلي. You can ask in English or in Arabic because interpreter translator is there. دينا اتفضلي يا دينا.
مساء الخير، يعطيكم العافية. بنشكر الحضور وبنشكر بالثينك ممثلة بالدكتور عمر شعبان. بدي أسأل إنه إحنا كيف ممكن مؤسسات المجتمع المدني أن تساهم أو تساعد في إنهاء الانقسام الفلسطيني ومساعدة الشباب والشابات الفلسطينيات في المشاركة في الانتخابات من أجل تولي المناصب القيادية. شكرا لكم.
شكرا دينا. Yes, Gary.
Okay, so I need a translation. My Arabic is poor.
So you did not get the translation. Okay, Rula تفضلي.
But Gary, please, Gary, please on French, on English, sorry, on English language in order to hear the translation.
Okay, now let me find that. I just told you my incompetent technical abilities here. So where do I do that, Rula, to begin with?
English, where is the icon? There is an English or interpretation.
Okay,
interpretation. So press on English language.
On English, okay, it's off.
Yeah.
So I think that lady will have to repeat her question.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, Dina, please.
Yeah, gotcha.
Ask Dina تفضلي اسألي السؤال مرة ثانية. تفضلي يا دينا. دينا معنا؟ دينا إسماعيل. طيب Gary, I think Dina asked a question related to the
عيد السؤال.
تفضلي.
كيف ممكن مؤسسات المجتمع المدني أن تساهم أو تساعد في إنهاء الانقسام الفلسطيني وتشجيع الشباب والشابات الفلسطينيات من أجل خوض الانتخابات الفلسطينية وإعطائهم حقهم في تولي المناصب القيادية؟
Okay, that was very, very low, and so it was just a little bit louder, would allow me to hear. I just got a little bit about Palestinian NGOs, but primarily the bulk of that I missed, so it just needs to be a little bit louder.
Gary,
That is good. Go ahead now.
Okay, Gary, let me put the question of Dina to you directly.
Matt, I'm not actually hearing you either. Seeing a lot of sound seems to be dropping here.
You cannot hear me, Gary? Gary, can you hear me?
Yes, I got you now.
Yes. Gary, I think her question.
دكتور أيمن مش راح يسمعك جاري لأنه هو بيسمع بس الترجمة، فأنت صوتك مش مسموع لإله فبيشوش. هلا هي بتترجم.
طب اتفضل يا دي. نعم خليها تترجم لي.
Yeah, I can hear you now, Matt. Being an English server was reducing the sound level, actually, from my perspective. So somebody gives me that in English now, I can go with it, along with Nicola.
So دكتور أيمن جاوب هلا أنت. أشوف أنت احكي بلكي سمع هلا. قصدي إنه أنت بتقدر
You know, Gary, I think, you know, Gary, can you hear me well?
Yes, I can hear you now. Great. Just go ahead.
You know, here a question. I think Nicola got the question, you know, in the right way. You know, her question was about, you know, the role of Palestinian, you know, civil society and NGOs in bridging the gap between, you know, Fatah and Hamas in the, you know, the internal Palestinian context, the internal Palestinian, you know, division that, you know, happened in 2007. What is the expected role of the Palestinian NGOs and civil society in really bridging the gaps and in promoting the issues of youth and women? Because mainly in Palestine, youth and women are really playing very much a crucial role, and they have, you know, something to say in this context. You know, how we can learn from the Irish experience and, you know, turn it to the Palestinian context.
Okay, I'll kick off and then I'll bring Nicola in relation to that. I think when there's fractured spaces, the key thing initially is private, under the radar dialogue. I think sometimes, and I've sometimes observed your space, like every day, I'm in touch with somebody in your space, one way or the other. I think sometimes things are spilling too much into the public space before there's any confidence to spill into that space. So if you're asking what should be the role of a bridge building NGO or mediating organization between Hamas and Fatah, I think a lot of those conversations should be taking place, and only when you feel there's something that's hopeful and positive to spill into the public space, it's then you go actually public. I think one of the keys to the Irish peace process was a lot of the dialogue and conversation was really kept incredibly confidential until there was something to offer in the public space. And because I think if you go too early, you end up with too many disruptive actors spilling into the space and a lot of fragmentation taking place. As regards the youth and women aspect, and particularly in the women aspect, I mean, everyone listening to me, research after research is showing that where women are at the table in peace processes, there is more chance of it succeeding. And I've said this publicly, so I can say it to you. I mean, both the non-state actors in my space who are involved in political violence, I often said this, and it's in relation to my own gender. So my own gender, men, if I'm offending you, just listen in for a moment. But I often said, if you lock 40 men, and I'm underlining the word men, in a room, listening to their own reassuring voices, it is a recipe for disaster. So really what your society needs, I think, as much as our society is, you need alternative voices speaking into those spaces. Because many times it's just a group of men sitting in a room, it's becoming an echo chamber. They're not listening to the next generation. They're not listening to women. You've got to create spaces where people are hearing alternative voices. And that was one of the key things in the Irish peace process, creating alternative voices, speaking into those spaces. So someone was coming in, maybe it was a disagreement, which is just fine. So come ahead if you're doing that, I don't mind. Okay, Nicola, give me your experience as a woman, the role women played in our space, Women's Coalition, etc., stopping those alpha males for arguing continually.
Well, I would have to agree with your analysis, Gary. I think some of the things that women leaders have brought in our space have been, first and foremost, that willingness to listen, to just sit and listen to the challenges. And sometimes we see the temptation to move too quickly to conflict resolution. And as you know, Gary, one of the big problems in our space have been people trying to fix problems with money, complex questions of community relations and history, and people trying to throw money at the problem and say, well, what do you want? And, you know, we'll build it, we'll fix it, we'll create a space, and not willing to have those difficult conversations. And that's where a lot of women's leadership has come in, but also in some of the very courageous challenges to violence as well, and particularly speaking up for young people and trying to protect their futures. And so I would say one of the big lessons in terms of the confidence building is just being willing to sit in that space with the discomfort of the reconciliation process, hearing the very hard truths about how we have treated each other. And as has rightly been pointed out, that that's not just about inter-community narratives, but it's also about intra-community narratives. And to allow the space for those grievances to be articulated. And then from there, the role that civil society leaders can play is having that long-term vision. Gary has already referred to the tendency for political leaders to think more in the short term, and where civic leaders can make a real impact is articulating the long-term vision for a shared future and what a shared society might look like.
And it's interesting, as Nicole saying, I mean, and for those who are academics on the call tonight, there's been a lot of research done between opposing factions, so between sort of IRA against UVF or British state forces, etc., etc. There hasn't been a lot of academic research done on keeping your own constituency together. So, I mean, you're saying there that what you call sort of intergroup consensus, and sometimes, as you know, within Palestinian society, as we know within British Irish society, sometimes dealing with your own constituents is more difficult at times than dealing with the perceived enemy. But yet you'll never have a peace process unless you bring your constituency with you and actually getting them over the line. And that's the key of a good leader. I mean, I think it is being courageous to take those steps, but not stepping so far away that when you look back, there's no one behind you. So that intergroup consensus hasn't been researched. I mean, there's 101 papers you'll Google tonight on academia.ed, etc., about enemies talking to one another. But that intergroup consensus, as we all know, sometimes is fraught with more difficulty because you're accused. Oh, they're betraying the Palestinian cause. Oh, they're betraying the British cause. They're betraying the Irish cause. Sometimes your own detractors are the most difficult people to actually deal with. So any more questions or comments there?
Yes, Gary, thank you. I think, next question, Nihad Al-Khatib.
Good evening. I thank you all for this symposium, or what you call. I think the similarity is established between the Palestinians and the Israelis in one side and the Irish case in the other side, not between the Palestinians and the Palestinians. This is my first comment. The other comment is that, is there any, it is a question actually, is there any Israeli civil society who is ready to acknowledge the Palestinian rights and to reach for the just peace as a basis for the cooperation and collaboration between the two civil societies to prepare a ground for the big reconciliation? Thank you.
I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I read today, which a number of you may have as well, the Geneva Peace Initiative, which is an organization based in Tel Aviv. And I mean, they just put out another pile of research there today saying that the majority of people still believe, despite the skepticism, that the two-state solution is still the best solution. Now, I know there's a lot of skepticism within Palestinian society around that, and I can understand why. I mean, I can put that through to Dalal or to Ahmad if they want to distribute it to it, but they've done a lot of research on it, saying, I've often said, when I've been in your space, and I've said to many Palestinians in Belfast, Palestinians are not going anywhere. Any more than Israelis are going anywhere. Any more than British Unionist Protestants in Northern Ireland are going anywhere, or Irish Catholic nationalists are going anywhere. So we have that alternative. Either we learn to share this space together, or we just continue to kill each other and dehumanize one another. And I mean, as I look at your space, I know, and I mean, Nicola's last point there about hope. I mean, I often look at Palestinian society, and I've said this to Dalal on a number of occasions, it's almost as if someone put in a hose in the Palestinian society and sucked all the oxygen of hope out of Palestinian society. There is a despair at times. I mean, will this ever change? Will this always be like this? Is there any way we can actually move this forward? I mean, within our space, and just a couple of very human stories, In the 1990s, a number of our key actors went to South Africa. Now, South Africa was different than the Irish space, as it's different in your space. I'll tell you how much they hated each other. They wouldn't go on the same airplane together. They wouldn't travel in the same buses together. They wouldn't eat meals at the same table together. But they came back from South Africa with a phrase I've often used over the years. When they saw the possibilities in South Africa, they didn't come back jumping with joy, but they came back saying this, maybe, just maybe, it's possible. And so I would say to Palestinians today, and I know sometimes the hopelessness and despair that Palestinians feel, just maybe, it is possible. Because both Margaret Thatcher, who had that wonderful nickname of the Iron Lady, Winston Churchill, who was called the British Bulldog, said the Irish problem is intractable. I mean, I was reading the other day there, I'm sure you read, Nicola, as well, about a former British Secretary of State who got on an airplane after spending a little bit of time here, and he said, quick, get me a bloody whiskey, what a damn awful country. And that's how people saw this space, as just a mess. But in the 1990s, if you were to say some of those key things I said, political leadership was encouraged by civic society to begin to take the risks. And the other interesting thing, I had to say this here, sometimes the politicians were the slowest people to move. It was British Army generals and non-state military actors who were some of the most innovative people for moving this space forward. So in other words, the people who had fought the war realized we've had enough. And sometimes politicians bless them. But by and large, most politicians are not in the theater of conflict. But it's ordinary Palestinians or ordinary Israelis or ordinary British or ordinary Irish people. So that is why civic society needs to be in part, because most of the suffering that takes place in our societies is ordinary people on the ground. And that is why civic society needs to take part in this and take ownership of an actual peace process. Nicola, I'll bring you in there.
Well,
Yes.
I had a personal experience that really brought home what Gary is saying to me about hope and about the benefit of international exchanges. So in March 2017, I had the opportunity to go to Colombia and do some casework on the ground in Colombia around their peace process. And it was 3 months into the collapse of our political institutions, and we've already talked about why that was such a terrible time. But it was so demoralizing because people on the ground, civic society leaders, they felt, here we are, we're sliding right back again, back to the bad old days. And so I went to Colombia feeling really disheartened and thinking these people are going to be looking to me, asking me to give them hope for their peace process. And I really don't feel very hopeful. But as soon as they started to ask their questions about how you could transition armed actors, about how you could create spaces where victims felt safe to tell their stories, it brought home to me how far we had come, actually. And the things that we had achieved through our peace process were absolutely unthinkable to people on the ground there in Colombia. Now, obviously, it's a different context and they have their own challenges, but the essence of what they were hoping to do, we had achieved through our peace process. And sometimes we can lose sight of that. And it is just where people, yes, on the one hand, there was a feeling that there was a stalemate and that no one could achieve their goals through violence. But there was also that significant movement in civic society that really wanted peace and wanted a better future. And where that exists, you will find dialogue partners across the boundaries. And it's about having hope, having openness, and being willing to trust that when you reach out that you will find them.
Yes, thank you. جماعة أي سؤال آخر؟ يعني حدا عنده أي ملاحظة أي سؤال؟ طيب, if there are no questions, Gary, I don't know if I can ask a question in this regard. Yes.
Realize.
As chair of the session, we generally give more space to our audience and to our colleagues who are, listening to you. But that does not mean that, we have to keep mum. I have one note, Gary. I really enjoyed your representation very much. In both, as I said, at the theoretical level as well as at case practical level, as well as, the words of Nicola. Both presentations are very much, complementary to each other. I have a feeling that social reconciliation, although we have to get engaged with civil society, with civic education, with religion, with social movements, sometimes I have a feeling it is difficult to achieve really practical, result without political agreement at the top of the level. So I feel, political leadership is more active, is more influential when it comes, to the real, political reconciliation, in the ground. So we cannot move, towards social reconciliation and community reconciliation unless we have a strong political agreement between political leaders and political elites. I don't know if I am, right in my perception or in my thought. I need your comment, as well as the comment of Nicola, Gary, please.
A couple of things around that. I often say, do we in civic society hold our politicians accountable? Now, remember, it's us that elect those politicians. And that's why I think, and again, let me illustrate this by a story going way back to that Skenos project. In 2001, I put together this thing called the Inner East Forum. You call it the Ramallah Forum if you want.
Yeah.
I brought together a number of key people within civic society, be it in Ramallah or be it in East Belfast. Because what I was finding about, so if I lifted the phone to a politician, hi, Gary here, can I see you? They would have said, yeah, leave it with me, I'll pass it to my secretary. And they probably said, well, Gary's there, he's maybe 2,000 people around him in his community space, just ignore him. Now, when I put together an East Forum, we did this exercise in the early days. So I went around religious leaders, women's groups, youth workers, community activists, and we counted up between us, we were engaging with 25 to 30,000 people every year. Now, when I then rang the politician as Gary, the chair of the Inner East Forum, they knew it just wasn't Gary singular, it was Gary corporate speaking on behalf of 20 to 30 other people who were engaged with 30,000 people. So how do politicians work? There's possibility of 20,000 votes in relation to that. So the problem sometimes of Palestinian society, and I've said this to you guys a number of times, is too fragmented. You need closer collaboration. You need stronger civic bonds together to give yourselves a bit of civic muscle so that when you engage with those politicians, you're actually holding them accountable. So I'm not knocking politicians and saying this, my closest friends are politicians. But in doing that and holding politicians accountable, you can also then create a space to give them political muscle in some of the difficult negotiations. So it's not a one-way street, it's a two-way street of partnership. But too many politicians in so many spaces are elected and there's no civic accountability. So how do we do that? Nicole, I'll put you in that one as well.
Well, our 1998 peace agreement provided for a civic forum, and political leaders said, yes, that would be a great idea. And there were some early conversations, some early attempts, and then nothing happened. And when everything fell apart in 2017, political leaders depended on civic leaders to keep things running, to cover those gaps in essential public services. And when the institutions came back up, they said to the civic leaders, thank you very much. We, really value your contribution. We need to keep this engagement going. Again, they have in that most recent agreement a provision for civic dialogue, and it hasn't happened again. So we see that tension there, and civic leaders need to be more vocal in holding the political leaders to account. But civic leaders also need to be self-critical about how they approach the political leaders in that regard, because we have seen as well in our context opportunities where political leaders have been able to divide and conquer. So they've been able to provide spaces where they give special access to business or certain sectors of business of the economy. They give privileged access to charity representatives from certain sectors at certain times. So they have been able to divide civic leaders and play that to their advantage. And there hasn't been enough self-critical analysis from civic leadership in that regard. And the last thing I would say is that the work of reconciliation is complex, it's multi-layered. Political leaders absolutely have moral and ethical responsibilities in that regard, and their leadership is decisive in terms of framing the political context in which the work of reconciliation will take place. But you also cannot simply legislate for reconciliation, and in that regard, it needs everyone.
And I think of that, maybe, you know, something for the future to think about, if I can chat with Dalal about this as well. I mean, it may be interesting at some stage through the Arab American University, you know, to get a key delegation of Dalal, yourself, and other key civic leaders to spend some time here. I mean, there's been lots of Palestinians in and out of this space, as you know, over the years, but to devote a full week to looking at the role of civic society in actual peace building, and just nothing else, you know, not meeting like victims or just say, look, let's specialize in a week that looks at this, some of the structures, some of the infrastructure, etc., etc., etc. I mean, our peace process is fragile, but I mean, a senior Irish politician in a conversation the other day said it is still one of the most successful peace processes on planet Earth in the last 50 years. And I know when Palestinians are here, and Israelis as well, this is not utopia. In a strange way, that's actually good, because if Palestinians are out in Belfast and felt it was utopia, they'd all go back to Palestine depressed. We are still wrestling on a daily basis in civic society and political society with holding a fragile peace process together. And if Palestinians ever get over the line in building a peace process, you will be doing exactly the same. It's not utopia. It's a long generational struggle to deal with those toxic roots that created your conflict and created ours as well.
You know, Gary, thank you for your suggestion. Yes, I think, you know, to benefit from your experience and to share your experience with us is really very much inspirational, you know, at this stage. And indeed, I have written a piece of paper on the role of the Palestinian civil society in the internal domestic, you know, reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas. And it is not strange to have some findings that, you know, civil society did not play that much influential role in impacting, you know, real events on the ground between both, between both political factions. And I have another note, Gary, you know, I have another worry. I feel, you know, under civil society, we have the NGOs, and we have the social movements. In your representation, you have focused more on the NGOs part, although I feel social movement may be more galvanizing in, you know, spreading, you know, the message of peace and the message of justice in both cases, the Irish case and, you know, in the Palestinian-Israeli case. I don't know if you want to comment on this part of, you know, NGOs and social movement, you know, what are the plus and minus points, you know, here and there. You know, I'm sorry to trouble you, you know, at the end of this.
I know. And I mean, immediately think, obviously because of what's happening today in the United States, you're immediately thinking the Black Lives Matter, who were a social movement and still are a social movement. And I suppose in our space, the trade union movement here in many ways in the Irish context have also been a social movement. So I suppose I'd be saying, as I often do, and Nicola say the same, I mean, it's not either or, it's both and in a sense. I mean, it's harnessing the ability for both those things to happen. Because I suppose when social movements do come about, their sizable members of NGOs actually spill in under that wider banner and umbrella. And I suppose I look at certain spaces. I mean, I look back to the peace people way back in the 70s. And I mean, people could say, did they fail? Did they not fail? I mean, I still think, okay, the violence didn't stop, but there were seeds maybe sown in the 70s that allowed that to spill into the 80s, because by the mid-80s, I mean, the IRA and some of the loyalist groupings, they were never going to say this publicly, but they knew there was no military solution to this conflict. They knew that ultimately there had to be a political solution. And I mean, as I've often said, you've heard me say this before, the three ways of resolving conflict: annihilation, genocide, containment, or negotiation. And maybe just some of those movements set the seeds on the table that allowed people to move towards negotiation maybe quicker than what they could have if that hadn't happened. Nicole, just past you there, or Nicola, I'm getting.
If I could share some of the learning from the experience of the churches over the years, we have seen that there's certainly a value in developing specialized expertise in certain quarters, but a weakness of the church's approach to the peace process is that they relied for a long time too much on responses that really became compartmentalized and didn't impact the whole membership of the church. And they were also too slow to develop those collaborative initiatives with the rest of civil society. And what is being realized now very clearly is that the challenges presented by the unfinished work of peace are so complex that no one actor can hope to meaningfully make an impact in isolation. It really does need the collaborative approaches, and where, yes, we need specialized interventions in some sectors, there needs to be more attention to where we have not developed that capacity at grassroots, local, community level. And I think it comes across as well if we have an analysis of funding and impact, that for all the money that has been poured into this place for peace building processes, it has not meaningfully improved the lives of people in our most socially deprived areas and the areas worst affected by the conflict in the way that we would perhaps have hoped. And I think some of the questions that you raise are important in that context.
Yes, Gary, my last point, just you can comment on that maybe in one or two sentences. In my introduction, I have defined, reconciliation as a liberal peace project. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, let me give you a quotation from a South African professor who said this: reconciliation is no cheap matter.
Yeah.
It does not come about by simply papering over deep-seated differences.
Yeah.
Reconciliation presupposes confrontation. And then he says, a cutting to the very bone without anesthetic. The wounds of society cannot be healed with the use of a band-aid or a sticking plaster. The abscess of hatred, talking in South Africa, between black and white, nation and nation, has to be sliced open. So, I mean, the word reconciliation, and listen, it actually came up in the discussion Nicola and I were involved in this morning. I think we've made it a kind of very soft, weak word. Reconciliation is a very, very painful experience. I mean, I told a story, I'm doing some work in the US at the moment around the legacy of slavery. And, you have people using the word, we want racial reconciliation. There can't be racial reconciliation until there's racial justice. I mean, how can you reconcile with someone who's screwing you into the ground? It's impossible. So as Nicola said as well, there has to be a change in societal structures to allow meaningful reconciliation to actually take place. Or it's not reconciliation. It's just a cheap form of feel-good niceness. And we need to get away from that. You're dealing with decades of pain in your space. We're dealing with centuries of pain in our space. We're not just going to flick a switch and this is going to happen overnight. It's a long, protracted journey to change these spaces. So I will finish there.
Yes. I don't know if Nicola wants to add something, last point, or is it okay?
I would just say briefly, it's one of the terms that is most often abused in the political discourse, where it is reduced to attempts to draw a line under the past, to silence victims, to end efforts towards truth and justice. And that is the complete opposite to the true meaning of reconciliation.
Yes, yes, thank you very much, Gary and Nicola, for this, wonderful, evening here in Palestine. We enjoyed your presentation. I will give the floor now to Roland to close up, and please, yes, Roland, تفضلي.
Gary, thank you, Nicola, for this very fruitful and informative presentation. وكمان بحب أشكر الحضور، شكرا كتير لكم على المشاركة. And also I would apologize from behind Dr. on behalf of Mr. Omar Shaban, because he has an complication with his internet, so he cannot be with us until the end. So he's sending his regard to Mr. Gary and Ms. Nicola, and he would like also to thank you for your presentation and for being with us tonight. So thank you very much. Thank you again. And شكرا كتير للحضور المتواجد معنا، وإن شاء الله بنشوفكم في المرات القادمة في الأنشطة الخاصة بمركز السياسات والدراسات حل السلام. شكرا كتير لكم، تصبحوا على خير.
شكرا
دكتور أيمن.
Thank you, Gary. الله يعطيكم العافية. Thank you, Nicola. Thank you, Gary. And we hope to meet, personally, hopefully in the future, inshallah. Yes, inshallah. Okay. So then, thank you very much. Enjoy.
Good night, everyone, and best wishes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for